In this episode, we focus on a skill that sounds formal but matters in everyday reality, figuring out whether an artificial intelligence, AI, policy, and its supporting procedures actually meet legal and regulatory expectations. New learners often assume compliance is a single checkbox, like passing a test once and never thinking about it again. In practice, compliance is more like staying within lane lines while the road keeps changing because laws, regulations, and enforcement priorities evolve over time. AI adds extra complexity because it can affect people, privacy, and decisions in ways that create new obligations, even when no one intended to cause harm. The point is not to become a lawyer, and it is not to memorize every rule in every country. The point is to learn how to read what an organization says it will do, compare it to what external rules require, and then judge whether the policy and procedures are specific enough to be followed and verified. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first mental shift is understanding the difference between a policy and a procedure because compliance requires both. A policy is the organization's promise about what it will do or not do, written at a level that leadership can stand behind. A procedure is the repeatable method that shows how people actually carry out that promise in daily work. Beginners sometimes think a strong policy is enough because it sounds confident, but if it is not backed by procedures, it becomes a slogan rather than a control. Compliance failures often happen when policies use broad language like protect privacy or use AI responsibly without explaining who does what, when they do it, and how they prove it happened. Procedures fill that gap by defining decision points, reviews, approvals, and records. When you evaluate for compliance, you are checking both layers, whether the policy aligns with legal and regulatory obligations, and whether the procedures are capable of delivering what the policy claims. If either layer is weak, the organization may look compliant on paper while failing in practice. Next, it helps to clarify what legal and regulatory compliance means in the AI context, because it is not one single rule. Compliance is a relationship between external requirements and internal behavior, where internal behavior can be demonstrated with evidence. External requirements can include privacy laws, consumer protection rules, employment rules, financial regulations, safety standards, and sector-specific obligations. Some requirements are explicit, like how personal data must be handled, while others are indirect, like the obligation to avoid deceptive practices or to provide truthful disclosures. AI policies often intersect with these requirements because AI systems can process personal data, infer sensitive traits, automate decisions, or produce outputs that influence human choices. Evaluating compliance means asking which external requirements apply to the organization's use cases, then checking whether the policy addresses those obligations in a way that can be implemented. A policy that ignores a major requirement is not compliant, even if it sounds ethical and well-intentioned. A practical evaluation begins with scope because you cannot judge compliance if you do not know what the policy covers. A strong AI policy should define what the organization means by AI, what types of systems are included, and what uses are covered, such as internal assistance, customer-facing recommendations, or decision support in high-impact areas. Beginners should watch for scope gaps where a policy covers only custom-built models while ignoring third-party services, or covers only production systems while ignoring pilots and experiments. Those gaps matter because regulators usually care about impact, not whether a system was built in-house. Scope should also address where the policy applies, such as business units, geographies, and data types. If an organization operates in multiple jurisdictions, a single global policy can still work, but it must acknowledge that different rules may apply and explain how conflicts are handled. When scope is vague, teams interpret the policy differently, and inconsistent compliance becomes almost guaranteed. Once scope is clear, the next evaluation step is mapping obligations to policy statements in a way that reveals missing coverage. You do not need a legal degree to do this if you focus on common obligation themes. Privacy obligations include lawful basis for processing, purpose limitation, data minimization, transparency, and individual rights, which are central in frameworks like the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Security obligations include protecting data and systems against unauthorized access, which may appear in privacy laws, sector rules, and general security expectations. Fairness and non-discrimination obligations can appear in employment, lending, housing, and public services, and they matter when AI influences outcomes for individuals. Transparency obligations can include providing notices, explaining certain decisions, and avoiding misleading claims about what the system does. Record-keeping obligations can require documentation of assessments, incidents, and decisions. When you evaluate a policy, you are checking whether these themes are acknowledged, assigned to owners, and translated into actionable requirements rather than left as values. A key compliance weakness in many AI policies is over-reliance on general ethical language that does not connect to enforceable requirements. Statements like "we will be fair" and "we will respect privacy" are fine as principles, but they do not tell you what the organization will do when there is a conflict between speed and safety. A compliance-aligned policy usually includes specific commitments that can be tested, such as requiring assessments before high-impact use, requiring approvals before deployment, or prohibiting certain uses unless strict conditions are met. Beginners should also learn to distinguish between requirements and aspirations. Aspirations describe what the organization hopes to achieve, while requirements describe what must happen and what happens if it does not. Regulators and auditors are usually interested in requirements because requirements can be verified. If a policy never uses decisive language that creates obligations, it may fail to drive compliant behavior. In evaluation, you want to see that the policy creates real guardrails, not just a mission statement. After policy language, the next focus is procedure detail, because procedures are where compliance either becomes real or falls apart. A procedure should explain how a team identifies whether an AI use case is high risk, how it conducts an assessment, who reviews the assessment, and how approval is granted or denied. It should describe how data is selected and approved, how model changes are managed, and how issues are escalated. It should also clarify what records are created at each step and where they are stored. Beginners often expect procedures to be very technical, but many compliance-critical procedures are about decision-making and documentation, not code. For example, a procedure might require that a product owner documents intended use, identifies affected groups, and confirms that required notices exist for users. Another might require that legal reviews marketing claims to ensure they are not deceptive. Evaluating procedures means checking whether they are specific enough that two different teams would follow them similarly. Transparency is a major compliance concern, so a careful evaluation should examine whether policy and procedures create truthful communication about AI use. Transparency is not just about telling people that AI exists, because that can be meaningless if the message is vague. It is about ensuring that people are not misled about what the system can do, what data it uses, and what its limitations are. In some contexts, transparency also includes explaining certain decisions or offering a path for questions and challenge. Beginners should watch for policies that promise transparency but fail to define when disclosures are required, who writes them, who approves them, and how they stay current as the system changes. They should also watch for procedures that treat transparency as a one-time announcement rather than an ongoing obligation. If a system evolves, the disclosure may need to evolve, and compliance depends on that alignment. A policy that ignores this creates risk, even if the system itself is technically strong. Privacy alignment deserves special attention because AI can quietly expand data use beyond what people expect. A policy that supports compliance should address purpose limitation, meaning data collected for one reason should not be reused for unrelated AI purposes without proper justification. It should address data minimization, meaning the organization uses only the data needed for the purpose. It should address retention, meaning data is not kept longer than needed and deletion happens when required. It should address individual rights and how the organization responds to requests, especially when personal data is involved. Procedures should explain how teams document lawful grounds for processing where relevant, how they assess data sources for sensitivity, and how they manage access controls. Beginners should also understand that privacy compliance is not only about external users. It can apply to employee data and internal systems too. Evaluating AI policies means checking whether privacy obligations are embedded into lifecycle steps rather than treated as an afterthought. Security is another compliance area that often appears in both laws and regulatory guidance, and AI systems have unique security angles. Policies should connect AI use to security requirements like access control, logging, incident response, and vendor risk management. Procedures should explain how AI systems are monitored, how anomalies are investigated, and how incidents are reported and escalated. Beginners should not assume security is separate from legal compliance, because many legal frameworks expect reasonable security and penalize failures that expose data or harm consumers. A policy that says security is important but does not require specific protections for AI data flows, model artifacts, and outputs may be too weak to support compliance. It is also important that procedures address third-party components, because many AI capabilities rely on external services. If the organization depends on vendors, compliance may require contracts, assessments, and ongoing oversight. Evaluating compliance means checking that the policy and procedures cover the full supply chain, not just internal development. Fairness and discrimination risk is an area where AI compliance can become complicated quickly, but evaluation can still be grounded and practical. A policy aligned to legal expectations should acknowledge that AI can produce unequal outcomes and that the organization has obligations to avoid unlawful discrimination. Procedures should define when fairness evaluation is required, who performs it, what evidence is expected, and what happens if issues are found. Beginners should look for policies that treat fairness as optional or as a purely moral topic rather than a compliance topic, because in many high-impact contexts, fairness connects to enforceable rules. Another evaluation point is whether the organization defines which decisions are considered high-impact, such as decisions that affect access to opportunities, services, or essential resources. If high-impact use is not identified, the policy may fail to apply stronger safeguards where they are most needed. Compliance-focused evaluation should also check whether there is a path for human review or challenge when automated outputs influence outcomes, because that often intersects with legal expectations. A common compliance gap is weak governance over change, because an approved system can become a different system over time. Policies should require that material changes trigger reassessment, especially changes to data sources, intended use, user populations, or model behavior. Procedures should define what counts as a material change and how change requests are reviewed and approved. Beginners should pay attention to this because many compliance problems do not come from the initial launch, but from gradual expansion and reuse. A system approved for internal summarization might later be used to draft customer-facing advice, which can raise new obligations. A system trained on one dataset might later ingest new data that introduces privacy or bias risk. If policies do not force teams to revisit compliance when changes occur, the organization may unknowingly drift out of compliance. Evaluating a policy for compliance means checking that it anticipates change and includes a mechanism to keep decisions current, not frozen in time. Record keeping and auditability are also part of compliance, because many regulations and oversight frameworks expect that decisions can be shown after the fact. Policies should require documentation of risk assessments, approvals, exceptions, incidents, and monitoring results. Procedures should specify what is recorded, who records it, and how long it is retained. Beginners should recognize that record keeping is not busy work. It is how an organization proves it followed its own rules and met external expectations. If a policy says assessments are required, but procedures do not require storing assessment results, the organization will struggle to prove compliance. If exceptions are allowed but not documented, exceptions become invisible, and invisible exceptions become unmanaged risk. A strong evaluation checks whether record keeping is integrated into the workflow so it happens naturally, rather than being a last-minute scramble. It also checks whether records are understandable to people outside the immediate team, because compliance questions often come from leadership, auditors, or regulators who need clear explanations. Another essential compliance angle is training and awareness, because policies cannot be followed if people do not understand them. Policies should define who must be trained, on what topics, and how often, especially for roles that approve, build, deploy, or use AI systems. Procedures should describe how training completion is tracked and what happens when training is not completed. Beginners sometimes think training is just a basic reminder, but compliance programs often fail when people treat training as a formality rather than a competency. Good evaluation checks whether training content matches the policy's requirements and whether it is tailored to real responsibilities. For example, users may need to know how to interpret outputs and how to escalate concerns, while reviewers may need to know how to assess risk evidence. If training is generic and disconnected from actual decisions, it will not support compliance. A policy that demands responsible behavior without building practical understanding is setting the organization up to fail. When evaluating compliance, it is also important to account for jurisdiction and industry context without trying to cover everything at once. An organization may face different rules depending on where it operates and what it does, and an AI policy should either be tailored to that reality or explicitly designed to accommodate it. A one-size-global policy can be fine if it sets a strong baseline and includes a method for applying stricter regional rules where needed. What is risky is pretending that one policy automatically satisfies all requirements everywhere without any mechanism for local adaptation. Procedures should also reflect operational reality, such as who is responsible for tracking regulatory changes and updating policy requirements accordingly. Beginners should learn that compliance is not static, so evaluation includes checking whether the organization has a maintenance process. If a policy is never reviewed, it may slowly become misaligned with external expectations, and teams may keep following it while unintentionally falling behind. The practical outcome of this kind of evaluation is identifying gaps that matter and describing them in a way that leads to improvement. A gap is not just missing text. It is missing control over a real risk that a regulation or law expects the organization to manage. Sometimes the gap is policy level, such as not addressing personal data reuse or not defining prohibited use cases. Sometimes the gap is procedure level, such as lacking a defined approval step for high-impact deployments or lacking a process for reassessing changes. Sometimes the gap is evidence level, such as requiring reviews but not storing proof that reviews happened. Beginners should aim to describe gaps in plain language that ties the external expectation to the internal weakness. That makes it easier for leaders to understand why the gap matters and what kind of fix is needed. The ultimate goal is not to produce criticism, but to strengthen the organization's ability to meet obligations reliably and to prevent harm. The main point to carry forward is that evaluating AI policies and procedures for legal and regulatory compliance is a disciplined comparison between external expectations and internal reality. Strong policies define scope, create real requirements, and align with obligations around privacy, security, fairness, transparency, record-keeping, and change management. Strong procedures translate those requirements into repeatable actions with clear owners, clear approvals, and clear evidence. Metrics and records help prove the procedures are actually followed, and training ensures people know what compliant behavior looks like in their role. When any of these elements are vague, missing, or disconnected, compliance becomes fragile, and the organization is exposed to both harm and enforcement risk. If you learn to evaluate policy and procedure language with an eye for specificity, lifecycle coverage, and verifiability, you gain a practical ability to separate responsible governance from optimistic promises, which is a central skill for trustworthy AI oversight.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.